Excellent question, Matt Farina. It normally starts at the half hour. I think normally we wait a few moments for folks to join, but I don't know why no one is talking now.
Yeah, the people who normally run the meeting don't seem to be here yet. So yeah, I agree. Let's get started. We have an agenda. I think, Matt, you might be the first one on the agenda. So maybe we should get started with that, and maybe the rest will arrive later. Yeah, so Matt, go for it.
All right. So can you all hear me?
Sure.
So I was asked to come here and talk a little bit about Helm 3. And particularly because how you deploy packaged applications affects multi-cluster, and we're going from a Helm 2 world with Tiller and lots of things to Helm 3 is a major breaking change from Helm 2. And so I'll just dig into kind of what we've got. Helm 3 kicked off at the Helm Summit back in February, and since then we've been working mostly on clarifying our directions, so that way we just steer everybody in kind of the same direction, and you know, kind of agree to what's going on and the major themes we're going to attack. So we're kind of focused, right? So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. All right. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
So one of the very first things that we came to is we actually took a step back and said, we want to do some user stories, and I'll get on that in a minute, and we wanted user profiles. We wanted to make sure we are heading in the right direction to meet the needs of who our audience was. Because when we started talking about stuff, the audience was all over the place, and people had all of these desires. And Helm is not trying to solve all of everybody's problems. It's trying to focus on a specific set, and then kind of had clear interfaces so people who want to focus on the other problems know how Helm can fit into that picture. And so one of the first things we did was we actually worked on a set of user profiles that identified the profiles in scope and out of scope. The in scope is, the application operator, and these are profiles describing roles. The same person may end up fulfilling more than one of those roles in some companies, and in other companies it may be different, right? So we have an application operator who's actually going to operate an application. The application distributor, this is the person who might package up a chart and distribute it. And one of the things that I like is Datadog's a good application of this. They have stuff, that an agent that are running cluster that actually phones home to their software as a service, but they're not the main users of it who are going to consume and operate the application. Lots of people in different companies are, in different organizations. And so Datadog will package up what they need to run in a cluster in a community chart, and then distribute that for others to use. But it could be even somebody within an own company who's doing this. Then there's the application developer. And these, by the way, 1 through 5, they're actually in priority order. So we are prioritizing application operators over distributors, over application developers, who are the people who write the business logic for the applications, over supporting tool developers. And these are the people who write things that sit around Helm or might interact with Helm. And then the Helm developer. And then the out of scope one is the cluster operator, because we're interested in dealing with applications and not necessarily the operations of a cluster itself, but the applications that run in or on it. I don't know what the right word is. And so this we came up with, and then we moved into some things like user stories, and then how we were going to build different parts of it. And there were a lot of conversations that happened at the summit and afterward to kind of get into this. This gives an overview, and the user stories are actually at the end. We've been collecting user stories from different places, from notes, from summit conversations, from interviewing people at companies, because we've been going around to some of the major Helm users and just asking, how do you use it? What do you need? What are your interactions like? And so what we've come to is a Helm 3 design proposal that was shared last Thursday, and we'll be continuing to talk on it. And once we're in good shape, that's when everything will get going. But the top level summary is, first, Tiller is gone. For those of you who don't know, there is Helm, the client side, and Tiller, the server side, that continues to live on. And in this case, Tiller is going to go away completely, and Helm will be a client-side piece of functionality. It will do some work with CRDs, because when Helm 2 first came out, CRDs did not exist at the time, nor did TPRs. And so it's been around for a little while now. And so this is actually going to embrace CRDs to store the metadata in cluster.
I assume, to go along with that, Matt, that aggregated APIs are also in scope, right?
So with the CRDs, we think we can just get away with a couple of CRDs, or maybe it's a CRD in secret. I'll have to look at the current iteration in here. And we don't have to add controllers or anything else. We can do everything else client side. So we don't have aggregated API. It's just store the data within a CRD within the cluster, and that's it.
I'm sorry, I had completely misunderstood what you were talking about. I retract my question, carry on.
That's all right. Helm 1 had no tiller component. It was when Helm merged with Deployment Manager that a server-side component was added. And so it appears to be going away again because a lot of people have been trying to work around it. And there are things such as RBAC, because if you have tiller has to now have a user or interaction in order to do those things. So how does RBAC work in that world? If you remove tiller and the Helm client does everything, then the user that uses Helm or would use kube controller, whatever, becomes the one with the rules. And it becomes a little bit easier to manage things like RBAC rules, authentication, and authorization compared to the situation we have today.
A quick question, Matt. So that topic in general is pretty interesting to me. Absent the RBAC complications, would you guys prefer to have server-side logic rather than client-side logic? Are there any other reasons why you moved away from server-side logic?
Because right now you have to have a service account in the cluster that can go create the instances of your applications with tiller, and then you're dealing with authentication and authorization. Yeah, so
that's what I meant by RBAC. So if there was a good solution to that, where the complications with service accounts, etc., were solved, would you prefer to run this? I mean, it seems like there are a million benefits to doing it server side. I'm just wondering whether there are reasons other than permissions and authentication related problems that you moved back to a client-side model.
There's a lot of other use cases for the way people end up deploying their applications. So there are a number of folks who actually want to generate everything out of Helm and then go take it through other workflows, and then they have to work around tiller to do so. There's projects such as Tiller Local, or people who've built their own tools that wrap tiller so they can get the outputs out of it and then do something else with them. And so it turns out that there's a lot of reasons not to have a server-side tiller or to interact with more native things within the Kubernetes ecosystem. Just try to do things more natively and move it more client-side. Works for a lot more use cases. And it removes some of the problems we have today. We have problems with gRPC connections breaking, going through proxies and dealing with that. And now we're dealing with keeping gRPC working and passing stuff back and forth. There are a lot of little extra complicated things, and we can make the system simpler by stepping back from that.
Okay, thank you.
Charts are updated with libraries, schematized values, and an extension directory. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Libraries allow us to have library charts because not everybody, there's a lot of don't repeat yourself. And so we want to be able to have libraries that allow you to do those kinds of things. Schematized values, if you deal with the values file now, you don't necessarily know what everything means or descriptions. You can't automatically generate UIs, and that's a problem. So schematized values would be a JSON schema file that could accompany the values file to tell you what stuff meant. And then extensions, and I'll get more into that in a minute. We're also going to do a lifecycle events emitter handler model around it, and that'll get into things like how extensions can grab a hold of events and then act on them within a chart. It's basically, this is an extension 2, which you can do with charts today. There will be an embedded Lua engine for scripting the event handlers. There was an analysis done to say what should we use and why should we use it. JavaScript, Lua, different possibilities. And we looked at libraries and Go that you could use. We got to cross compile for different languages and how do we distribute that. And it turns out that Lua worked the best in the analysis. So there's an embedded Lua engine to deal with that. State is maintained with a CRD, which is the release CRD, and a release version secret, or they might actually both be secrets now. We're looking at the best way to handle it, and they've gone back and forth between CRDs and secrets and some different things, but we're trying to keep it with a release and a release version object. Resources in Helm that were created by hooks. which were part of the event lifecycle, were not tracked before. You had to manually clean up for those things. They will actually now be managed, and so that way they can be cleaned up. And we'll be setting things like owner references in order to do that, and just work with the native garbage collection. So the part of the way that Helm is structured is there's a package library with everything in it, and then we expose that with a CLI, and the CLI is really just wrap around the package. And so where we've had a CLI that does a push base, I push changes into my cluster. One of the things that's long been asked for is to have a pull based, where you have a service running in the cluster that monitors for a change in chart set and then pulls those charts in and deploys those. It's a pull based model rather than the event push based model. And so one of the other projects that we're going to look at doing is takes that same package and creates a server-side service that can be used in a pull-based model. It receives events, pulls down chart updates, and then deploys them into the cluster. And this one is actually kind of interesting for the multi-cluster because you could deploy chart updates to your chart repository in one location, and you could have a Helm controller running in more than one cluster, and it could observe that a new version came out, pull those down, and deploy them within the cluster automatically. This kind of is more of the chef-based model, if you're familiar with it. We've actually had requests for this for quite a long time, and so that's one of the things we're going to look at doing now. Are there questions on this one? Because this really can get into the multi-cluster flow. No? Okay. And cross-platform plugins in Lua. Since we're already going to have the embedded engine, we've looked at exposing that because Helm is a pluggable system where plugins can respond to things like events in the lifecycle. Like Helm right now has downloaders, and those downloaders can be pluggable based on your URL scheme. So I can have S3:// and a plugin will have registered to fetch for S3. And so we see S3 isn't one of the default ones. We're going to drop that through to a plugin, and the plugin will handle the fetching for us. Well, how do you do that cross-platform? If somebody wanted to do that, say in Go, how do you deal with cross-platform binaries, especially when you get in, and then how do you deal with things that are non-POSIX? Because we've got lots of people who are writing this stuff in shell scripts and things like that. Well, how do you port that over to Windows? Lots of Windows developers aren't using Bash or shell scripts. How do you deal with that? Because there's just so many of them. And if we already have the embedded Lua engine, can we expose that Lua engine in a way that you can now write plugins with that engine that will then work cross-platform? And we figured if we had it, we could expose it this way. And then we're looking at packaging updates for repositories, a complementary command, Helm fetch, that lets you push into a repository as well as pull, which we have today. And the plugins would let you, you could push to a repository, and just like we have S3:/ can drop down to a plugin, we're looking at the same thing for push as well. We're also looking at updates to the packaging schema as a whole. That's not really included here. It's another issue because our friends at JFrog have found that when you go massively big on your package, Helm does things the way apt does, where it has an index.yaml file that talks all about your packages and your package versions, and that's sent around. So you can do search locally. You've got your metadata can be passed around and moved around that way. And it turns out that our YAML parsing is not very good. And so when you go really big, we end up using a whole lot of RAM when you add a repository and want to interact with it. And so we're looking at ways to shrink that down by using other YAML parsers or breaking up the index file into smaller chunks while still maintaining or attempting to maintain a lot of the security and information sharing models and distribution. So we're poking at that as well. That's kind of the overview of the different changes we've got going. This document actually outlines each one of those, from security considerations to repositories, plugins, the hook system, state storage, all of that in more detail. We actually, when we looked at things like, and one of them is user stories. And so we even look at what is a package manager, because we found that a lot of folks were having trouble identifying the difference between a package manager versus a configuration manager versus something else, and where you would use those compared to other things. And so there are a number of appendixes here to try to explain that. So now that I've kind of given a long-winded overview, and I'm good at long-winded, is there anything that you all would like me to dive into or questions you have?
Yes. I'm curious whether Helm is strictly for installation, or is there the concept of managing the life cycle of an application, including upgrades?
There is the lightweight ability to do upgrades. So there's things like hooks in there that can do upgrades. So you're saying I'm moving from this version to that version, maybe go run a job that then goes updates my schemas, things like that. There is a lightweight capability to do that. Helm is not trying to compete with operators or special purpose controllers and intimately know the needs of every possible application. And so while Helm includes a lightweight amount of this, probably about the same amount you could script with apt and Debian packages, if you want to do something complicated, a recommendation would be to use something like operators. In fact, I would say etcd in the community charts has an etcd operator one where operators are used along with Helm. And I know the folks at Oracle are working on a MySQL operator that can be used in the same kind of way. And we're talking to them about how that could fit into a chart as well.
And I guess like in the context of Federation, some of the prototyping we've been doing, there have been kind of open questions on how to identify the relationships between like Kubernetes API resources. Like if I have a PVC and it's depended on by like a pod, and I can't launch the pod unless that PVC is also launched. Like there's certain, like Kubernetes already has like ways of ensuring that things come up when they need to, but sort of in a larger sense where there's a little bit more, where it's less obvious. I'm wondering, sorry, long-winded. I guess I'm just curious if there's been any thought to how to represent dependencies between both within a chart, like these resources comprise an application deployed by this chart. Is there any sort of annotation or way of identifying that after it's deployed?
Helm has the notion of dependencies, and the dependencies, if I remember right, come up before the application itself does. And so every chart can have dependencies and dependency versions, and there's a requirements file and a requirements lock file, a requirements YAML to specify what you'd like, and a lock will lock it. It's kind of typical to a dependency manager where you can specify version ranges, and then you've locked and pinned to that. And so it does do the dependencies on other charts, and they can be from different repositories as well.
But it's more of an install time thing. It's not like you're defining things. It could be, I mean, in the case of Federation, if we're trying to distribute like configuration across clusters, there's been discussion about being able to detect when, like not all, like the resources that comprise an application are not properly targeted at a given cluster, and therefore the application would not be able to run because it like the target set is a subset of what actually the application actually needs. And so I think it's maybe, I'm sure it's outside the scope of Helm, but I'm just kind of curious if you've thought about how to represent the relationships between like the components.
So one of the things that we're seeing a lot in charts is they can be configurable for different cases. And so I could have a chart, and with one set of values, it may take WordPress. It might stand up MySQL in that cluster. In another cluster, it might use MySQL as a service and then pass those credentials into the application. The same chart and its configuration flags and the values. So one of the things that you could use is something like Helm File, Landscaper, or Armada, which are tools that sit on top of Helm in the configuration management space, and then they know which environments to pass which values into. And so you could say in this environment, pass this configuration in this other environment, pass this other configuration in. And so say you're using Service Catalog and you've got different plans and things like that in AWS than you do in Azure. You might say in this environment, use this set of configuration for Service Catalog to consume MySQL, and this other one, send this other set of configuration, and it'll set up the appropriate thing in each place, but the chart is capable of doing more than one thing. Is that the kind of thing you're getting at?
Kinda. I mean, to be honest, I've been blinders on. I haven't been considering Helm or how to install things. More like once you have resources in the cluster, how do I propagate it to multiple clusters? But I'm trying to step back and sort of see how they could interoperate. Because right now it seems like there's just, like if you want to be able to use Federation, Helm would be difficult, I think, to use Helm in combination with Federation, which I think is very suboptimal.
So with Helm 3, what really comes out of Helm 3 is the it's either CRDs or secrets that are done in the cluster, and then Kubernetes, normal Kubernetes objects. and that's it. So the state can be stored using standardized methodologies in the cluster, and then it's just normal Kubernetes objects that are going to be there with nothing running server side for Helm 3. So what would be the kinds of cases where that would be a problem with a multi-cluster setup?
I mean, we've been discussing the primitives of federation being like a template and a way to parameterize the template and a way to specify which clusters the template should be or the parameterized template should be distributed to. And so Helm being more focused on creating like Kubernetes resources, it's not at the level of abstraction that we're targeting. And so it's like, well, how would we step back and be able to use Helm to, do you see what I mean? They're kind of like doing parallel things, only Helm's like, I want to create Kubernetes resources in a single cluster, and Federation is I want to take these abstract representations of resources and then distribute them to multiple clusters.
What files does somebody need to pass into Federation in order for it to create objects and things in the different clusters?
Can I just interject for one moment? Firstly, I think we're kind of running out of time here. We've got quite a few things to do. And so I would suggest we perhaps schedule a follow-up. If there are more discussions that we would like to have, sounds like Maru's interested, maybe we should schedule a follow-up discussion. And then a very brief topic on, a very brief comment on the last question was that was one of the original reasons why Federation adopted the Kubernetes API, because it would enable things like Helm to deploy things into federations. So just a comment. I think we're going to have to move on. We got Tim on the agenda next. Tim, are you here and ready to?
I am here, yes.
Give us your roadshow. Cool.
Yeah. So I will share my screen, I think, as Matt finishes off his. Yep. And hopefully that's coming through. Also, this document is linked in the agenda document as well. So basically what we're doing, SIG contributor experience, is just coming out to each of the SIGs and trying to share a little bit of information and be a little more, I guess, engaged in how we're discussing and messaging things. And partly that this comes from a few things that have happened that have been a little contentious over the few months, but also that we just want to be getting the word out on a number of things. So that's basically why I'm here. I'm going to kind of go through maybe 10 minutes or so of information that we're wanting to share. So the first and biggest thing that I maybe was just alluding to is that we are working to make changes and hopefully improvements collaboratively with SIGs across the Kubernetes orgs, with the goal of giving a more common experience to contributors across the organization. And where this has gotten a little bit contentious is some things like the examples at the top of the doc there. So what LGTM means, or the definitions of labels, whether we have stale issues or not with the Federated bot, and other bot commands. So some of those things have gone across the dev mailing list and have gotten a fair amount of discussion. And that's what we want. We want discussion, but then we also want to ensure that that discussion is actually leading somewhere, that we build some consensus and are actually improving things, because we're hearing from contributors that some things are feeling hard, or the project can be difficult to approach because of some of these things where there's insufficient documentation or information or inconsistencies across the project in repos and SIGs. So where possible, we're trying to distill out some common things, get some discussion and consensus around it, get it documented and defined, and if there's something that needs a little bit of improving, maybe also do that as well. So there's a few examples there around some things that are currently underway. Issue triage guidelines is one, and new labels and commonizing labels is another one that are currently underway. And really we're looking and kind of being here to just say, hey, if any of you have thoughts, or if you see these things happening and you're not sure if or whether they'd map well to your SIG, then jump in the conversation, because it's a conversation. This is open source. It's a shared project, and we as a community want this to work well. So something that you may be seeing increasing, or should be seeing increasingly around this then, is how are you finding out about changes, and when do the changes happen. So like most of the stuff in the project, it's a lazy consensus model, but as a discussion maybe winds down on the mailing list, so like Kubernetes dev, at some point somebody would say, okay, here's what I think has evolved out of this discussion, what I propose we're going to do, and wait sort of 72 hours for any follow-on additional comments, and then go ahead and enact the change. Also, on the Thursday community meetings, we'll be making sure that things like this are announced. And I think, as you all would know, there's the rotating set of SIGs who are presenting there, but hopefully you also, outside of your presentation, have some representation there and are seeing what's going on. The next thing that we wanted to make sure that folks are aware of, I think you already are aware of because that was just tagged on the end of the agenda. So there's a new set of charter templates that the steering committee has released around SIG governance. And I'll just leave it at that, I think, because Quentin, you're intending to talk about that a little bit later today still. The next thing, our contributor guide. We have been working to improve the contributor guide. There's links there. We're also looking to start work next on the developer portions of that. So there's kind of we feel like there's two breakdowns of information in the guide. One is like, I'm a newcomer to Kubernetes. What do I need to do to be a productive member of the community and collaborate in terms of contribution mechanics? Then there's also the more deeper developer side where you're trying to understand the design of some particular area and some of the more nitty-gritty details. So we're looking to next start cleaning up that developer portion, but a bunch of work has gone in over the last quarter, kind of the last release cycle, to improving the contributor guide. If there are things that you all see within that are lacking, maybe relative to things that are unique in this SIG, we encourage you to add a contributing.md file in your SIG repo or your SIG directory under the community repo, just to call out any distinct things that you all would have there. The next large set of topics is mentoring. And our call to action here, I guess, is for the individual SIGs to be thinking about what your contributor growth strategy is. From the Contrib side, we're doing a number of things to try to make it easier for the community to grow in general, but it's something also to think about actively as a SIG yourself. So a couple areas called out here. We have a once a month meet our contributors session that's going on. So it's a Zoom meeting, but also kind of overlapping with Twitter and Slack so that people can ask questions and get sort of mentoring on demand. Then there's a couple of more formal programs. Outreachy is looking like it's going to come online in May with a specific goal of building new contributors. If there's interest from this SIG, definitely reach out to us in Contribex and let's see what sort of opportunities there are. The other one is group mentoring. So you may have heard of this over the past quarter. There was a test rollout of group mentoring and a test cohort. And the goal of this was to have a structured formal program with a set of people who had been identified as candidates to move up the contributor level. So our goal is not just to grow contributors, but also to grow the entire sort of pyramid of developers so that more contributors become reviewers and owners of maintenance, and we get the benefits of scale that you expect in healthy open source projects. So that has been running, and it was focused in SIG cluster lifecycle initially and had, I think it's 10 people, and a good chunk of them have actually gotten up to the point where they're probably going to be reviewers going forward. So that's looking like it was successful, and we're going to start trying to roll that out to additional cohorts over the next while. And then we're looking at the idea of a buddy program to get a little more intimately one-on-one. If, say, as a leader within a SIG, you see somebody who's in need of mentoring or has some growth opportunity within the group, and there's something that you'd like to delegate to them, for example, maybe setting up some one-on-one mentoring there to do a handoff in a building, but the leads engaging a little more proactively to build some aspect of their community into what they're looking for growth. The next topic then, Slack. if you have any questions on running your Slack channel, there's a link there on some guidelines, and Contribx can help. But one of the bigger ones we wanted to call out to folks, because we're noticing a lot of SIGs don't have pinned documents, and this is a subtle, simple little thing that you can do to make it easier for a newcomer who joins the channel. For example, in SIG Multicluster, in the description, there's a link to the meeting agenda document, but you could also pin other things. So you could pin links to other information, commonly asked questions, or your current issue list or feature list, or different things like that, so that when somebody comes along, they can see those most common links of information. And then finally, user office hours. So in a way, this is kind of like the Meet Our Contributors, but instead of being a contributor mentor focus, this is about people who are using Kubernetes and have questions on, or developing on Kubernetes, have questions kind of across the gamut. And there we're asking for more volunteers to help in fielding the questions. So if that's something that you might be interested in, again, there's discussion that happens on Slack in a Zoom meeting and interaction. If you're interested, follow the link there, and please volunteer and get involved. And then, yeah, that was basically the set of stuff we wanted to bring out to y'all. If you have questions, let me know, or jump in SIG Contribx on Slack and ask any of us in the group. And I appreciate you guys' time.
Thanks very much, Tim. Sorry, I was muted there. That was most informative. Does anyone have any specific questions for Tim before we move on? That was super useful. I think there's a lot there to digest, and really useful for you to put the link in our notes there, and people can read up on the detail behind some of that stuff, and come back to you with questions or discussions offline. Thanks, Tim. That was
awesome. Thank you.
Right, now I'm going to learn how to operate my desktop again here. Where are we in the notes? Right.
Yeah, meanwhile, can I request Matt, if he's still on the call, to maybe put up some links in the chat for reference in the notes? And Tim, if you also have a link to the doc you were sharing, or some other links that you want to.
Yep, it's the one that I was sharing, Tim. It's in the agenda now.
Yeah, I think that would be a great, if Matt could do the same, just stick a link to his document in the agenda. It doesn't get, otherwise it gets lost in the chat. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and there is a lot of information that can be processed in one meeting, I guess.
Yeah. Ivan, do you want to kick off with your demo?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Looks like Matt's dropped, so you might need to get, looks like Maru might be adding the link to the Helm 3 stuff.
Okay, thanks, Maru.
All right, so let me see here. Sharing my screen, and let's see if we can. All right, do you see what I'm sharing here?
Nearly. Yes, we can.
Okay. Let me know if you need the font size to be a little bit larger. I will take a look at this here. So, so this is going to be basically a demo of the workload prototype called Federated that we've been working on for Multicluster. So right now, basically, I have 2 independent Kubernetes clusters that are running. One is in US West and one is in US East. So we can go ahead and see that we have just a couple of clusters here. And
can I interrupt for one brief second? What does fnord mean?
Federated is, it's actually, I believe, pronounced Federated, and it basically means to like spread disinformation. So if you Google it, you'll see like a logo, like a Ford logo with Federated spelled on it, and various references to that. Maru may be able to actually give more context around the naming.
The point of picking a name for a prototype is picking something that is disposable and we don't actually want to use for reals. And Federated is not a name that I would want a product that I was developing and supporting to have.
Okay, no, I was just curious what the meaning was. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess to start the demo, I'm going to join together both of these clusters to be used for the multi-cluster workload. And to do that, there's a tool called KubeFenord, which is leveraged from the original KubeFed. And basically, what this is going to do here, and it looks like my mappings don't quite work in this shared mode. That's strange. Okay, so let's go ahead and join. We're going to join the US West cluster into the US West. We're going to create a new cluster, join it, and name it US West. And we're picking US West as the host cluster context because that's essentially where we have both the cluster registry and the workload API server and controller that are running. We're also going to add this cluster to the registry. This is the cluster registry. And so let's go ahead and launch that. And some of you may be familiar with some of the things that it would do, but basically it's going to create a namespace in the joining cluster and create some RBOC and service account in order to access the resources in that cluster. So go ahead and join the US East as well. And if we go ahead and get the federated clusters, we should be able to see that both US East and US West are listed here. And let's go ahead and do a describe on them. And if we can scroll up a little bit here, we can see that US East has been joined there. The cluster is ready. And similarly, we have US West, and the cluster is ready. So now we basically have a set of clusters that we can run some workloads against. And
can I ask a very quick question? So, or two actually. The first one is, could you just clarify the distinction between the context and the actual cluster? When you registered those, you gave the same cluster name twice, if I remember correctly. Could you just clarify what those two clusters mean?
Sure. So I think you're referring to this command here.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So,
the argument to join versus the argument to host cluster context.
Yeah, this the join is basically what you want to name the cluster. This could have been arbitrary, but just for consistency, I left it US West.
Okay. So you're creating a cluster named US West, first argument, and you're extracting all the information about it out of your local context name.
Right. Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. So you provide, you provide both you kind of provide the list of you provide the context of the joining cluster as well. In this case, because I've named it US West, it will use that as the context as well to grab the information from.
Okay, and that context is your local kube control context. Okay, cool. The other question was, could you just clarify the relationship here? So when you created those clusters, you ended up with something in your federation called a cluster, but it sounded like there was a cluster registry under the hood somewhere. Could you just clarify where all this information that we're looking at on the screen now lives?
So this information is part of the federated cluster resource type. That's part of Federated. Part of the workflow for creating the cluster registry was to have a list of clusters that you could potentially add to a workload, add to a federation, or you could just have them there containing some sort of metadata and auth info information. This is basically trying to kind of bring them together and show how they can coexist together. So if we do, for example, let's see, get clusters. This is listing the clusters in the cluster registry. And you could do any other set of operations on this if you wanted. But the list of federated clusters is the list of clusters that you would run a workload against, which you'll be seeing here shortly.
Okay, so those host cluster contexts in your join operations, do those refer to named clusters in the cluster registry, or do those refer to, I mean, it sounds like you created records in the cluster registry when you joined the clusters, or am I misunderstanding something?
Yes, that's correct. So we need a way to bootstrap ourselves a little bit here. So the cluster registry did not have the list of clusters to begin with. They could have been pre-populated, in which case then you wouldn't need to add them to the cluster registry. In this case, because everything was empty, it was kind of a fresh start, fresh demo here. We kind of needed to bootstrap ourselves, so provide some context in our existing kube config, and also add them to the cluster registry while we're at it.
So I think if you notice like -- add to registry, that's the command that ensures creation of the cluster resource in the cluster registry as part of the join.
Okay, so the information is replicated both in the Federation control plane and then also added to the cluster registry, if I understand correctly.
There's two parts. I mean, essentially the federated cluster and the cluster, the API endpoints that were formerly part of the federated cluster and Federation v1 are now split off into the cluster registry, and the API endpoints are no longer sourced from the federated cluster.
Guess I'm still a little confused. There's a status associated with each cluster. Is that stored in the registry, cluster registry, or in the Federation? Or
that's stored in the Federation, the federated cluster resource.
All the cluster registry is a canonical source for available clusters and the endpoints they can be reached at. And authentication to reach them is stored in a secret. The status is recorded in the federated cluster. And so it's just a separation of responsibilities.
Okay, I can ask you the questions offline. I'm still not clear how much of it is duplicated between the two and how much of it is
only the name. That's the only thing that's duplicated.
Okay, but so the endpoint parts are stored in the cluster registry and the health parts are stored in the Federation.
Yeah, because I mean, health can mean different things to different applications, so we don't presume that cluster registry should be the...
No, I'm just trying to understand what's stored where. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, feel free to, if you have any other questions as we go through this. So the next part of this kind of just show, now that we have a set of clusters that we can run workloads against, there's a set of resources you can create and have them propagate and provide different rules. And so right now we support federated namespaces, secrets, config maps, and replica sets. And recently we've added deployments as well. But for this example, we'll leave those out. So you can see here, there's kind of different configurations for each of these. And I won't go into all of them, but I'll go into replica set, for example. And some of you may be familiar with some of the docs that have been kind of going around documenting and showing this stuff. But basically, we have a federated replica set resource type here. And it's we're just going to name it test replica set, and it's going to go in the test namespace. And then we embed the replica set, the Kubernetes resource replica set as a template inside. And we just basically want 3 replicas, some dummy labels, and then we want the Nginx container image. So then we can look at override, which is another resource type. And we can go ahead and take a look at, we have this named federated replica set override. Again, it's just a test replica set. And this basically allows you to override certain fields in the original template. So in this case, we want to override the US East cluster name to contain 5 replicas instead of the 3 that we specified here on the left. And then lastly, we have federated replica set placement. And the federated replica set placement is another resource type, federated resource type here, and it allows you to basically have rules on where you want your resource to be propagated. Here, we're just going to list the clusters that we want them to propagate, and we're just going to list those clusters out here. And this is actually done for each of these resources here. So they're all going to be replicated to US East and US West. So let's go ahead and create them. Okay, so now that we've created them, we can go ahead and see how they've propagated. So we're just gonna loop through each of the cluster contexts. It's just a fancy for loop that's gonna loop through each of the context, and we're gonna get the namespace, test namespace that we just created. So you can see here that US West and US East both have a test namespace that was created about 30 seconds ago. So let's go ahead and get the other resources. So we want config maps. And we can see that test config map was successfully propagated there. Secrets, you can see the test secret similarly. And then lastly, which is probably the more interesting one, just for this short demo, because you can easily see the varied override. You can see that US East has a test replica set with 5 replicas, and US West has 3. So that's consistent with what we requested. So that kind of shows how they're propagated. And then real quick, we could show here some the ability to actually move resources from one namespace to another. So let's go ahead and just modify the federated namespace placement. Originally, we were requesting both clusters. So let's go ahead and remove like US East, for example, and we'll remove status there to avoid an error. So now that that's updated, we can loop through and see that the US East no longer has any replicas in it. And we can do the same and look at all the other resource types, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go show them all. So in order to bring them back, if you wanted to bring those resources back, you could specify US East again, that we want the resources propagated to that cluster. And then if we loop back through them, we should see them start to be scaled back up. And so here you can see the test replica set is being created and slowly being scaled back up to 5. So basically this, that's kind of concludes the demo. I mean, this Fedora prototype, you can see handles the workload by joining the clusters into the workload so that you can actually specify resource types that you would want to propagate. Then you can actually override certain parameters that you want to differentiate in your clusters, the way we did with like replica set here as an example. And then you can specify placement rules for where you want that resource type to be propagated. Are there any questions? I don't hear any questions.
Doesn't sound like it. Thanks, Ivan. That was useful. We've got about 7 minutes left or so. Does anyone else have anything they want to speak about today? There's a very brief mention I wanted to make at the end, but we can first deal with anything else. Anybody else have any topics they want to talk about today? If not, I'll head on to the Sig Charter refresh stuff. So very brief overview, and I'm not going to go into the detail here. I think it'd be more useful for people to just go and read the documents linked in the agenda first, and then we can have a kind of a Q&A session perhaps. But basically, the steering committee has done some work on trying to kind of help the SIGs get a little more organized in general. There's a wide variety of SIGs these days, and they all have various different degrees of success with governance and publishing, you know, who they are and what they do and who to contact regarding them, etc. So their steering committee put some work into trying to kind of make it easier for SIGs to emulate the successful SIGs. And what came out of that was a kind of a template for a SIG Charter. So basically standardizing the kinds of information that the steering committee would like the SIGs to publish, and the ways they would suggest that they operate themselves. And then out of that also is this area of SIG Repos. So there's a new GitHub organization, believe it's called Kubernetes SIGs. And under there it is possible to create repos. There are a set of basic procedures that SIGs need to go through to put their repos in there. And so that is essentially open for business these days. If you want to have a repo that is not part of the Kubernetes core and doesn't necessarily ship as part of the standard Kubernetes distro, but is logically work that is being done and owned by a SIG, that's the recommended place to put that work. And so what I think we need to do in the fairly near future is refresh our charter on the basis of the new templates that have been put together, and create the repos that we need. So off the top of my head, we've got the Cluster Registry, we've got fnord, which may or may not belong in there depending on what its kind of future is. And we have Nikhil's, what is it called? kubecli, whatever.
kubemci.
Say again?
kubemci.
kubemci, that's the one. So we may want to, reparent those repos into this SIG Repos organization. Does anyone know where all those repos sit? I know Nord, I think, is under your personal account at the moment, Maru, is that right?
That's correct. Once we exit prototype, the goal is to get a SIG repo and commence actual development.
Okay, so the intention is to move it in there. That makes sense. Jonathan, you're on the call. Do you have plans to, where is the cluster registry stuff at the moment?
It's currently in the Kubernetes org. I didn't have any plans to move it unless somebody says it was necessary to, because the Kubernetes org location right now is adequate. If there is pressure to move it, then I would do that, but I would prefer not to without there being a lot of pressure, because that's a decent amount of churn and frustration.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would leave it where it is if it's not causing problems. I guess it might get kicked out of there at some point, in which case the landing place for it would hopefully be this SIG organization.
Arguably, it's going to stay. I mean, it's not just a multi-cluster thing. It's kind of been general purposed as per the mailing list as more of an API endpoint registry, which that could be really useful in the context of a single cluster.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly either way. I'm just saying that if it gets kicked out and is not deemed to be part of the core Kubernetes distro, then it will probably get kicked out of that organization. But we don't have to have that discussion here. And then there is Nikhil's ingress stuff. Where is that at the moment? Does anyone know? And what it's?
That is in the Google Cloud Platform from organization.
Okay, so that's not sort of part of Kubernetes at the moment.
No, unfortunately Nikhil is not here. I don't know what plans he has to migrate it. I know that initially he put it there, since initially the work that he did was for GCP ingress specifically. As far as I know, the intention is not to make it be only for GCP ingress, but I don't know if he had plans to move it to the Kubernetes SIGs repository.
Okay, yeah, I had a similar discussion. I think his plan is, as you say, to have it support more than just Google Cloud, in which case it probably wouldn't belong where it is right now. But we can defer that discussion and decision till it's more relevant. Okay, so yeah, there you go. There's some reading material for you. And do we, I can do all of these SIG Charter refreshes and creation of relevant repos and things, or if there are volunteers out there who would like to put the PRs together based on the templates, that would be useful. Do we have any volunteers?
I can take some. Could you?
Oh, that'd be great. Is that Irfan?
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, if you want to do that, that'd be perfect. Thank you.
So two things before we wrap up. One, I've been having trouble lately.
Jonathan, we're struggling to hear you. Can you speak closer to the
Yeah,
mic?
voice is quite muffled.
Much better.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, much better.
Is it better?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So two things that I wanted to mention. Number one, I've been having trouble lately uploading the SIG videos to YouTube. For some reason, the recording files that Zoom has been making have been unprocessable by YouTube, which means that quite a few of the meetings, there was one a few weeks ago, which I just uploaded to Drive and shared with the SIG. At this point, I don't necessarily have the time to go through and debug why exactly that's happening for all the videos. So there will probably be some SIG videos that for now are uploaded to Google Drive. If somebody has the cycles to go through and attempt to convert them into a format that YouTube can use and upload them, I will certainly add them to the playlists. But I noticed that at least 2 of the meetings from the past few weeks have had that trouble as well. And I was unable to upload any of the 3 videos yesterday when I tried. I'll try again today with a better internet connection and see what happens. And second, there was an announcement last week. I sent a mail about the Cluster Registry becoming a CRD. I had no negative feedback, and so Paul has been prototyping that work, and we're probably going to figure out a plan to switch over from the current implementation to a CRD-based implementation. But that switchover we plan only to have happen once the CRD-based implementation is fully fleshed out in terms of code generation and documentation. We don't want to end up in a halfway state where the CRD exists, but it's not documented and it's unclear what to do.
Every time someone talks about fleshing something out, I think of like a David Cronenberg movie.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think we're out of time. Can anyone volunteer to try and debug why the recordings are not going into YouTube?
Actually, I did try one of the videos, Jonathan, which you shared a week or 2 earlier. I think the way to go would be try and convert it into some known format using some tools which might be available locally.
I would suggest we actually, sorry to interrupt you, Irfan, I would suggest we actually just punt this to Contribex or somebody like that, because presumably all the SIGs are running into the same problems. Everybody uses Helm, uses Zoom and records using Zoom, and everybody tries to upload to YouTube. So this is probably not specific to our SIG at all. Yeah, if one of you want to just reach out to Big Contribex and say, do you have a solution for us? That would be great. Can you do that, John? Seeing as you have all the recordings and stuff.
Yeah, I can do that. But this has been taking a decent amount of time. So if I can't get this figured out relatively quickly, I'm either going to ask somebody else to look into it as well, or else not upload the recordings. I
understand. What I'm suggesting is that I don't think our SIG needs to worry about it at all. So all you need to hand it off to Contribex, and if they don't, think it's their mandate, find out where it is and hand it off there, because it's not specific to the SIG as far as I can determine.
That seems reasonable. I can contact SIG Contribex about it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Ciao.